I'm Glenda Ritz, Superintendent of Public Instruction. I'm going to call this July 9th meeting to order. I think we're waiting on a couple people to call in.
Thank you. To start or join the conference, press 1.
And I found it was good.
You will now be placed into conference. To mute your line, press 6. To unmute, press. State Board of Education has joined the conference.
Brad Oliver.
Has joined the conference.
Tony Walker.
Has joined the conference.
Sarah, I was arranging things. Can you tell me who joined the conference?
Brad and Tony.
Brad and Tony joined the conference. Thank you. I've called the meeting to order. If we could have roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Present.
Mr. Elsner?
Present.
Dr. Freitas?
Present.
Mr. Hendricks?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Present.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Present.
Dr. Oliver?
Present.
Mr. Walker?
Present.
Mr. Lutz?
Present.
Mrs. Wicker? Superintendent Ritz?
Present. If you would all stand, please, for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First item is the approval of the agenda. Per SBOE staff, there is a need to remove action item E. Is that correct? Which is initiating rulemaking on accountability. I believe that will happen in August. And then add 2 discussion items, pre-K update and compensation models. Is that correct? And those are the only 2 additions? Okay. Any other changes to the agenda? May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Oh, so sorry. I gotta be sure to wait. Troy, you gotta punch me. Make sure I wait for those on the call. The agenda is approved. The first item is the approval of the minutes of June 23rd. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
The minutes are approved. The next item is the statement of the chair. Today's agenda is quite lengthy, so I ask for the public's patience as we work our way through the agenda. I also ask for respectful discourse to take place and remind the members of the board, and both the staff of the department and the staff of the board, that it is an open meeting. Please refrain from texting, cellular communications, and sidebar conversations during the meeting. Thank you. Do we have comments from boards or reports to share?
Yes.
Yes.
Gordon will be first, and Tony, you'll be next.
Okay.
I was just going to say I'm honored to be reappointed by the governor to a 4-year term, and pleased to have the opportunity to serve, and look forward to addressing a lot of important issues here in the upcoming months and years.
Thank you. Tony?
I was going to say what Gordon said, so I'll just concur in his statement.
All right. Any other comments from the board? All right. We have, oh,
Chair, if I
sorry,
could.
BJ?
As I scroll through the hundreds and hundreds of emails that I get, and I would concur with Gordon and Tony, honored and humbled to be reappointed to this. Take it very seriously, and it's exciting, and I'm honored. But I'm a little disappointed in a membership. I don't want to specifically attack anyone, but I feel like the ISTA has spent. I want to encourage the ISTA, which I'm a member of, to make sure that information that we're getting out to our members is accurate. I scroll through the hundreds and hundreds of emails of my colleagues and people I respect and people that I have relationships with, and I feel like there's almost an intent to get them excited with a misrepresentation of what's going on here. So as an Evansville Teachers Association member and an ISTA member and an NEA member, I would caution the excitement just for, in my opinion, political gain. And it bothers me that I spend hours reading these things, and the people that are writing them are my colleagues, and they're upset, and in my opinion they shouldn't be upset, because there's nothing that they should be upset over. We can agree here, we can disagree here, there's Democrats, there's Republicans, but when we spend all of our time and energy here, it takes away the focus away from students and teachers, and that's where it needs to be. So again, I asked no one to agree with me. I don't agree with everyone here all the time, but I would say that let's agree to disagree sometimes and be respectful about it. And let's make sure that our energy and our focus is in the right direction, and try to be cohesive as opposed to, I would say, the way that things, and I apologize here, I'm rambling, but it is frustrating. When my colleagues are upset, it bothers me. So I guess my caution would be to make sure that the information that we're doling out is correct, and that our energy and our focus is in the right direction, and that should be the students of the state of Indiana. So, thank you.
Thank you, BJ, and I don't think I had a chance to personally congratulate you on your reappointment.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Sarah?
I'd just like to make a quick statement regarding my disappointment regarding the comments in the statement that was issued yesterday. The board clearly shared their expectations regarding the waiver submission. I don't think we could have been any clearer in our requests, yet many of them were disregarded. Dr. Oliver asked at the May meeting for ample time to review important documents rather than to receive them at the last minute with no time for careful consideration. The document that was filed with the USDOE was forwarded to us with many amendments and attachments missing. Certain portions of the submission on growth, for example, were left out, and recommendations were inconsistent with Indiana law. So, as in regards to the statement regarding the threatening of the submission for waiver, of the waiver and the blame, I'd just like to point out that the conversation was necessary and is necessary to have, and we need to continue to make sure that we're informed and able to contribute to that process.
Thank you for your comments. Any other comments?
Madam Superintendent.
Tony?
Is that Tony? Is that you? Oh, I guess not. All right, so we're on to the public comment.
Excuse me, Madam Superintendent, Brad Oliver, like to make a statement.
Oh, yes, Brad?
Sorry, I apologize, I'm using Skype, so I hope that you all can hear me there okay.
We can.
Yes.
I have a unique opportunity going on right now where I'm in the United Kingdom with several Indiana teachers visiting schools, and it's been interesting to watch and observe how teachers here in the United Kingdom are approaching some of the same complex and challenging work of preparing students for life. And as we've had opportunities to travel and sit on the bus and talk, we've had a lot of opportunities to discuss education back in our own state as a profession, and even the current political climate surrounding K-12 education. They say that perception is reality, and certainly coming into today's meeting, great efforts have been undertaken by some to create the perception that this board does not wish to work collaboratively with the state superintendent, or that we wish to take away some power from her as chair of the board. Yesterday afternoon, the state superintendent issued a press release attempting to create to her or the department on the issue of responding to a condition on our NCLB federal waiver and calling on Governor Pence to intervene in removing that petition from the board that they'll consider this afternoon. Superintendent goes so far as to suggest that the passage of the resolution could actually hurt Indiana's efforts to seek an extension. And with all that said, perception is not reality. And the reality of the matter is that our waiver was already placed in jeopardy when the U.S. Department of Ed found Indiana to be non-compliant in 9 of 18 areas where specific assurances had been made at the time the original waiver was granted. The reality of the matter is that the meeting procedures mutually agreed upon and negotiated with the help of a consultant from the National Association of School Boards of Education have either not been followed, misunderstood, or interpreted differently. These attempts to shape public perception only make it more challenging to build the relational trust that's critical to our ability to work together on behalf of students, teachers, parents, and community. Today, I just want to be clear, there's no effort to remove Superintendent Ritz as chair of the board. We simply need to come up with clarity around how we do our work. And we need to make sure that policies and procedures that govern the decorum of our meetings are uniformly followed. Similarly, I think when we look at the resolution on the waiver, asking for things such as making sure that amendments to the submitted waiver or any work around the waiver is congruent with Indiana statute, or that we allow the board the opportunity to have input on anything related to issues of assessment or accountability where the board has statutory responsibilities, seems reasonable. So I would hope today as we do our work, I appreciate the comments already made, but I would again just call on us to remember that we're here focused on trying to develop the best policies that we can, and we need to set perception aside and continue to focus on reality.
Thank you for your comments. We're on to general public comments. I have one person who has requested to speak under general comment. That would be Marianne Schlegel. Marianne Schlegel-Ruger. And Marianne, you have 3 minutes to address the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we end up knowing so much about the board members because you're in the news all the time, and you never know who's talking to you probably. So I will tell you a little bit about who's talking to you. I'm not a teacher, quite definitely not a teacher. I don't have any family members who are teachers, unless you go back a lot of generations to someone who I think might have taught Evan Bai's grandfather. I don't think I have any family members who are union members, and I'm quite definitely not. I'm not a Democrat. I'm actually a Republican. So I share several things with a lot of you. Like some of you, I spent over a decade in a large Indianapolis law firm. And like most of you, I'm guessing, I'm a parent. Most importantly, I'm a parent. And that's why I wanted to talk with you today. I know you probably so feel like you're in the trenches because you're immersed with this, you're inundated with it. I'm sure you're getting emails and memos daily, many times a day. I'm a parent and I'm in the trenches. I'm really in the trenches because I live in a school district where if I want to put my child in a school whose very existence and being open next year or the next is not totally dependent upon what test scores that school gets. In other words, I'm an IPS. There's only a few schools open to me, and unfortunately they haven't had room for my daughter. So she was in a charter school, and unfortunately it closed very suddenly, without notice, and I watched her go through that, and I watched her grieve for her friends and her teachers and what she knew school to be, because I think you probably know for every child, school is exactly what they start with. And that's just how it is. And they don't realize it's different anywhere else. Whether that would be better or worse, that's what they know. And that's what they feel comfortable with. So we're kind of laying out for a while. We've had to go to a private school because we haven't really had a choice. Sometimes choice means no choice. And I know that's a really hard discussion to have. I'm not going to have that one. But I want to give you some advice for today, and it's kindly advice because I really do respect all of you, and I think you're all working to do the best job you can. That daughter's now 11, and she's finally entered the stage of slumber parties. And we have some really good advice in our family for slumber parties because I have a 16-year-old too. And what I tell them, which is what I remember from that stage, is any one of you will make really good choices. I trust my daughters. They're going to do the right thing. But when you put 5 or 10 girls or people together, sometimes there's a lot of pressure. And sometimes you really have to think for yourself. And so today, I really encourage you to think for yourself, make the decision that you know, in each of these matters, some of which are contentious and some of which aren't at all. We all know what the right thing is to do on some of these. Think for yourself, make the decision that you know you can live with, whether or not you're appointed again. That doesn't matter today. And go with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're on to the consent agenda. We have 2 items before the board. The governing body plan change for Perry Township and the SBOE petition resolutions for 3 cause numbers. So there's a motion to approve the consent agenda. Do I have a second?
Second.
Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. The consent agenda is approved. Next, we have adjudications. We have 2 adjudications, the determination of state tuition support withholding from IPS and the determination of state tuition support withholding from Gary Community School Corporation. Both are routine items that we do annually. And so Melissa Umbre, I believe you're coming, and Gordon, I believe that you are chairing this adjudication. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I will excuse myself. I don't have to leave, but I'm not going to be voting.
This is an administrative proceeding conducted pursuant to Indiana Code 2031 9.53 to determine the amount of state tuition support to be withheld from the state tuition support that would otherwise have been distributed to the Gary Community School Corporation from July 1 to December 31, 2014. The funds withheld are to be used for the operation of the Turnaround Academy. The reference number for this proceeding is 15-072014. Board members received a copy of the certification that was provided to Dr. Pruitt, in which Dr. Pruitt indicated that the corporation concurs with the recommendation. Because Gary Community School Corporation agrees with the department's withholding recommendation, the adjudication is limited to determination on the documents filed with the board. The board's decision will be determined by an affirmative vote of at least 6 members.
As stated, pursuant to Indiana Code 20-31-9.53C and 511 IAC 6.2-9-4B, the State Board of Education is charged with determining the amount of tuition support and federal funds necessary to fund each Turnaround Academy. You have before you information regarding our recommendation on Gary Community School Corporation. The department recommends withholding for the period from July 1 through December 31, 2014, to be used for the operation of Theodore Roosevelt Career Academy, the amount of $1,972,100.50. That amount represents funding for basic tuition support, special education, career and tech education, and the complexity grant. Our recommendation is based on December 1, 2013 special ed count multiplied by the applicable categorical amount. We use the May 2014 estimated membership count multiplied by the applicable amount for basic tuition support and complexity grant funding, and the October 2013 honors count multiplied by $1,000 for honors funding, and the September 2013 career and tech ed counts multiplied by the applicable amounts to determine career and tech ed funding. Throughout fiscal year 15, the department will periodically update the state tuition support funding to reflect actual accounts. Reconciliation and adjustments will take place between July 2014 and December 2014 payments to reflect updated count information. We'll reconcile then any over or under payments in the withholding and payment amounts for Gary Community Schools. Additionally, you should have a signed certification from the Superintendent's Office for Gary Community School Corporation reflecting a review of the Turnaround Academy payment and withholding amounts for fiscal year 15 that reflects the May estimated count information and their agreement with the July 2014 through December 2014 estimates and the reconciliation of payments within that period. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? The amount to be withheld for Theodore Roosevelt Career and Technical Academy is $1,900,072, $1,972,100.50, and the parties have agreed to this amount. Do I hear a motion to approve these recommendations?
So moved.
Second.
All board members in favor of this motion signify by saying aye. All opposed? The motion carries. Moving on, this is an administrative proceeding conducted pursuant to Indiana Code 2031 9.53 to determine the amount of state tuition support to be withheld from the state tuition support that would otherwise have been distributed to the Indianapolis Public Schools from July 1 to December 31, 2014. The funds withheld are to be used for the operation of the turnaround academies. The reference number for this proceeding is 14-072014. Board members received a copy of the certification that was provided to Dr. Farabee, in which Dr. Farabee indicated that the corporation concurs with the recommendations. Because IPS agrees with the department's withholding recommendations, the adjudication is limited to a determination on the documents filed with the board. The board's decision will be determined by affirmative vote of at least 6 members.
Again, pursuant to Indiana Code 20-31-9.5-3C and 511 IAC 6.2-9-4B, you are charged with determining the amounts of tuition support and federal funds necessary to fund the turnaround academies. You have before you the information concerning the recommendation for Indianapolis Public Schools. The department recommends withholding for the period from July 1, 2014 through December 31, 2014 to be used for the operation of the turnaround academies the following amounts. For Emma Donnan Middle School, $1,289,018.63. For Arlington Community High School, $1,772,315.75. Emmerich Manual High School, $2,199,954.25. And Thomas Carr Howe High School, $2,541,176.38. These amounts represent funding for basic tuition support, special education, honors, career and technical education, and complexity grant. Our recommendation, again, is based on the following counts for each turnaround academy. The December 1, 2013 special education counts, the May 2014 estimated membership counts for each turnaround academy for tuition support and complexity grant funding, the October 2013 honors counts multiplied by $1,000 for honors funding, and the September 2013 career and technical education counts multiplied by the applicable amounts for career and tech ed funding. Throughout fiscal year 15, the department will periodically update the state tuition support funding to reflect the use of actual counts. Reconciliation and adjustments will take place between the July 2014 and December 2014 payments to reflect the updated count information for the applicable grants. Will reconcile any over or under payments and withholding and payments resulting from application of the updated counts for the period of July 2014 through December 31, 2014 state tuition support funding. Additionally, you should have before you a signed certification from the Superintendent's Office for Indianapolis Public Schools that reflects a review of the turnaround payment and withholding information for fiscal year 15 and reflects the use of updated membership estimates from May for basic tuition and complexity funds, as well as agreement with the July 2014 through December 31, 2014 estimates and the reconciliation of payments within that period. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions from the board? Hearing none, the parties have agreed to the amounts of state tuition support to be withheld from IPS. The amounts are as follows. Emma Donnan Middle School, $1,289,018.63. Arlington Community High School, $1,772,315.75. Emmerich Manual High School, $2,199,954.25. and Thomas Carr Howe High School, $2,541,176.38. Do I hear a motion to approve these amounts?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor of supporting this motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I forgot to state under the approval of the agenda that I wanted to move an item out of courtesy for a guest that we have for a speaker. I believe we have on discussion assessment update, and we have with us Derek Briggs to speak. And so if without any objection, I would like to move that to the first item of new business. So we will hear that discussion in your presentation, followed by the Education Roundtable Resolution on Assessments. And my pardon for not doing that at the start. Is that okay? You're welcome.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to wait to get my, I have a few slides set up there, so I'm going to wait till those get up. While we're waiting for the slides to get up, since there's no point in having dead air, let me just introduce myself. My name is Derek Briggs. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado. I'm the chair of the Research and Evaluation Methodology Program, and my background is in psychometrics and applied statistics, and I've been brought in to offer comments and thoughts about what's going on with Indiana's transition to a new student assessment. And so that was timed fairly nicely. The slides are up there, so I'll go with that. I just want to mention that I probably don't need to say this, but do feel free to stop at any point with questions, clarifications. I do have some things that I've prepared, but mostly I expect this to be something of a bidirectional presentation, so please do ask a lot of questions. So I was given a little background on some of the key issues that are going on right now in Indiana as you have a transition to a new student assessment that's aligned to new standards for Indiana. And the main issues I want to touch on are the following four. Here are the issues that
Can I ask just a quick question?
Yes, absolutely.
Do we have copies of this so that we may take notes, or no?
I'm sorry, I didn't provide the copy of these slides ahead of time.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, I'll happy after the fact to make these available. Yeah. So these are the issues that I was asked to address, and I'll touch on these four, but I'm happy to touch on others as they arise. The first one was issues around growth options, and here I'd like to perhaps offer a little comment on a memo that I believe was circulated by Dr. Damian Biabenner around some of the growth options that could be taken for Indiana to still comply with its ESEA waiver. And so there was at least, I believe, one recommendation made towards a particular approach, and I'll offer a little comment on that, and I'll also offer a little bit of a contrast between the approach that's being recommended and the approach that's been worked on, in which I had some previous experience with the A through F accountability panel, which is a categorical growth approach. So I'll offer a little comment on contrast between those two approaches for thinking about growth. And then a second question I was asked to address, an issue that's come up is, in transitioning to a new assessment, why not just use NWEA's MAP test, a MAP assessment? And so I'll offer a little comment on some issues to think about in considering whether an assessment like the MAP would be a good direction for Indiana to go. A third question that's come up is, in thinking about a new assessment, whether that assessment should be an assessment that is an adaptive, a computerized adaptive assessment, or a fixed form test, and what are some of the pros and cons in thinking about assessments that have either of those two features. And then the last one I'd like to talk about is the CTB's, let me see if I get the acronym correct. It's the College and Career Readiness Transition Assessment. And there's some terminology in the discussion around that about an operationalized field test that's a little unusual. And I'd like to mention a little bit about my understandings of some key issues around what that means. And two in particular is the distinction between owning, the state owning and leasing test items. And the second one is that depending on decisions that are made about owning or leasing, how comparability in the way that standards are set would carry forward if standards were to be set at the end of this next spring's testing, and then carried over when a new vendor comes on in the following spring. So let me start a little bit with the growth options, and I want to start with this. In Dr. Benner's memo, he outlined a number of different approaches that could be taken to compute growth. And really, if you think about it, there's sort of three key issues, which is, and I'll sort of summarize them kind of a little bit flippantly in the following, which is that in thinking about an approach to growth, you have to figure out how can I compute it, how can I defend it, and how can I explain it. Right? And those three things, you have to have answers to all of those three things. And in Damien's memo, it mentions 5 different things, 4 of which could be computed. And the key issue that I hopefully don't need to go into too much detail about, because I think it's been pretty much on everybody's forefront of their mind, is that there's a difficulty in computing growth when you change assessments. That is, if you go from one assessment and then have a new assessment that's aligned to different standards ostensibly, what does it mean to speak of growth from the old assessment written to old standards to a new assessment written to new standards? Doesn't seem intuitively to make sense to speak of a way of computing growth for a particular student. Now, the approach that has been recommended is an approach called equipercentile concordance mapping. And essentially this works in the following way. It's essentially doing what you've done in the past to compute growth targets based on the I-step. And you would essentially, with the I-step, you're essentially coming up with a target that's expressed in the scale of the I-step. Since you don't yet have student scores on the new assessment that will be administered to new Indiana standards in the following spring, how can you express the target on that new scale when students haven't taken it yet? So the approach is basically to say, well, we're going to express it on the old scale. Once we have information on the new scale, we'll try to map, based on the distribution of student scores that we observed on the old test, we'll try to map those score percentiles onto student percentiles on the new test. That's the basics behind the approach that's been recommended. At this point, I think it's a reasonable approach to take. I will say this, that it's an approach that relies on a certain stability in essentially the distribution of scores you would get on the I-step versus the new test that you'll be getting. If there's sort of a one-to-one translation in that, that is, if you think like the students who score very well on the I-step will be the ones who will score very well in the new assessment. Now, in an absolute sense, their performance, if you compute achievement levels, might not look the same, because perhaps the new test will be written to more challenging standards and performance won't look as good. But in general, those who scored really well before will score very well again. The equipercentile approach that's being considered here should give you a fairly good approach to talking about growth. If, on the other hand, there's an interaction such that you actually see that some students who had done very well before, for example, if they are really good, if you really think that the new assessment is going to get at depth of knowledge in a way that hadn't been done before, perhaps there were some students who did really well before that now actually won't do so well, and there were some students who had done poorly before that will actually do better. If something like that happens, then there can be some more problems in this sort of approach, and you could actually not get consistent answers. So, go ahead.
Do you have a mathematical level of correlation there that you'd be concerned if it dips, if these cohorts suddenly dip? What would be can you give us a mathematical number, percentage-wise, or cetera, that would start to concern you on that correlation?
So generally, what you're hoping for is that in taking these approaches, you're hoping the tests, the old I-step and the new test, you're hoping the correlation will still be between about 0.7 and 0.8. If the correlation is well under 0.7, you start to worry quite a bit about any attempts to sort of equate, in this very loose sense about the term equating.
Thanks for letting me interrupt.
Yeah, sure. So I will say along those lines, one of the things that as an academic, you always have to be careful with me, because I always will tell you ways that you could conduct studies to examine these sorts of things. I know that you're on very short timelines, so those are hard things to carry out. But there's no reason that the approach that Dr. Biedermeier has outlined couldn't be studied, because what you just simply need is you need any situation where you actually have 2 alternate tests that you could be using for students in a current year, right? And so, for example, just as sort of a rule of thumb to figure out if this approach would work, what you could do is say, what if instead of using a student's I-STEP math score this year, what if instead of saying targets for that I-STEP math score based on the score, the I-STEP math score in the year before, what if I set targets for the I-STEP math in the year before on I-STEP reading, right? Now, you know that reading and math are pretty strongly correlated. They're probably correlated in the range of what you might expect the new test and the old I-STEP to be. So this could, sort of by doing an approach like this, you could say, well, what if I were trying to set targets on what is clearly a different scale, the reading scale, using the math information, right? You could do that and sort of say, well, here's what my guess would be about what the right targets would be, but you actually have the truth, because you know you do actually have math scores. So you could actually try out this sort of approach that Dr. Bienebenner has described with existing data to get at least some sort of a upper bound on how far off things might be by taking this approach. So that might be something that you might want to have staff or even Dr. Bienebenner himself try out to give you some assurance about sort of how strong assumptions you're trying to make. But in general, I would say this is a reasonable approach to be taken given sort of the situation you're in, which is not optimal. This is probably the best case scenario for how you could get into appliance with your ESEA waiver. So in general, I would say that I agree with the recommendation Dr. Bienebenner has given for a recommended approach. I believe this was brought to the board, and so in a nutshell, I think it's probably the best thing you can do. I do want to mention the following, a concern that I think you need to be conscious of, regardless of whatever growth approach you take, because it could be that you're sort of thinking of this as a short-term fix, and it may well be in a year's time that we're back to the drawing board, and you're thinking about once you have reached some sort of stability in the assessment system that you have, you might want to revisit this question about what's the right way to think about growth. And so I want to just point out the following, which is that one reason why growth metrics have been introduced into schools and teacher accountability is they have a potential to communicate something that's different from the status metric. This was the great criticism, or one of the great criticisms of No Child Left Behind, which is that No Child Left Behind really focuses on the status of students in any particular year. Are you proficient? Have you gotten over the bar at any one point in time? But it doesn't really take into account where a student started at the beginning of the year. So potentially, growth can communicate something quite different from status, right? And so it might, in particular, help, you might believe that it shows that some low-performing students might actually be very high in growth, so you might actually get very nuanced information. Conversely, it might be that some very high-performing students are very low in growth, right? And these are the areas that, if you're only focusing on status, you might miss. So I'll just say the following. The more strongly a growth metric is correlated with status, the more that it may communicate redundant information, right? So if your growth metric and your status metric are really tightly correlated, why have two different metrics? They're really telling you very similar things.
I'm not getting that. Wouldn't that reinforce each other?
No, if they're very strongly correlated, then they're essentially you're getting most of the same information from the two metrics. I don't think they'll reinforce it. It's only, so I say may because it is quite possible if they're very strongly correlated. It does represent, to some sense, if you believe that only students that were very high achieving are the ones who grow.
Got it.
Right? But if they're very tightly correlated, they tell if for example, if they were correlated 1, right? It would essentially tell you that there's no point in, once you know that a student has low status, low proficiency, you know they haven't grown.
Okay.
If they're high status, high proficiency, you know they have grown, right? The less that correlation, the more that correlation diverges from 1, it tells you that you could get different information.
But you also have to disaggregate. There'd be groups of students where you might get different message on those. The potential for low performing students who come in at a disadvantage, you could find the growth potential there is you get a different message than the proficiency measure.
So I'm not sure I entirely understand the question if you're talking about.
Because different cohorts of students, and we want subgroups all to perform.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to, in our strategic plan, you see careful analysis to make sure that we have high performing schools for all children.
Sure.
Then it'll be students who start off behind or are in a place where they're behind, measuring their growth and their ability to be proficient are two very different things. and to figure out what systems, processes, or methodologies advance growth faster, especially when you start disaggregating and look at groups of students who have traditionally scored behind. Then as policymakers and professional educators, we'll want to know those differences. So knowing both in that instance, when you get down into particulars, methodologies, policies, practices could be very worthwhile, correct?
Sure, I agree.
And to piggyback on that, I would add that, you know, educators, you know, and parents, I feel, need to see both. Whether they're tightly correlated or not, they need to see where the performance pieces are, and they need to see where the growth is, even if there's tight correlation between the two. Both pieces of information are vital in order to give the educator and the parent and the student, more importantly probably, you know, where they need to go, to see a visual of both of them so that they clearly have that in mind.
That's absolutely right. I would just amend to that, add on to that. The only point I'm raising here is that the more tightly correlated they are, the more you're telling a story that suggests that students who are low achieving can't show growth or don't show growth. So the intuition that most people have, parents included, I would say, is that they're probably weakly to moderately correlated. That you would expect to see there's a lot of low-performing students who actually can show great growth, and there's a lot, sometimes there are high-performing
But
students.
if your
who don't.
intention is to turn that around and actually entice the growth to occur, you have to see both measures, so that as an educator, you know, and a student, you can clearly see the visual of, oh my gosh, I achieved this, but I didn't grow very much, okay? I need to do this to get here. And I think that just from a visual standpoint, that educators are in want of being able to see both pieces simultaneously, so that they really can inform their instruction.
I don't disagree at all. I'm certainly not
Okay.
arguing against having growth metrics.
All right.
Yeah.
Good morning, Derek. Thanks
Mhm.
for being here. I have a question about the growth approach dealing with low-performing and high-performing students. And it's really a statistical question, so I'm glad you're the expert here this morning. Seems to me that low-performing students have a greater opportunity for growth compared to high-performing students, which statistically, common sense would say is a shorter range. And if that's an accurate statement, if it isn't, let me know. But if it is, how do we accommodate for that potentiality in the new assessment system?
Sure. That really depends a little bit on the nature of the assessment. So it depends, when we say high performing, sometimes what we mean by that is they're in the highest performance category, right? And depending on where you set that threshold on the test, it may well be there's quite a bit of room still at the top for students that are in the top category to grow. I think in particular with the new assessments that you're developing, if anything, there's probably going to be concern at the other end of the scale. That there's not enough room to show the bottom as opposed to the top, because there is some sense in which at least experience of pilot testing assessments that have been written to new standards to date have shown that students haven't done as well on those tests. I think it's quite unlikely that going forward you're going to see this kind of problem, that even the students that are in the higher performance categories, I think you're going to see there's quite a bit of room to demonstrate growth for them in the top end of the assessment. But the general concern I think that you're raising is a legitimate concern, which is you always worry that are there ceiling effects? You also have to worry, are there floor effects? And both of those are things that are empirical questions that one can examine.
So this morning you're presenting some concerns, and
I
I'm waiting.
haven't quite gotten to the, so this was sort of a prelude to what the empirical concern is, but yeah.
And beyond the concerns this morning, are you going to present some solutions or some recommended solutions, or is this a concern-driven presentation?
I will be happy to present some solutions. Sure.
Is there a question online?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, Tony?
Okay, I have a similar concern to what David's raising, because I don't feel that now we adequately have the tools to really assess the growth of our most advanced students. And the way this system seems to be, what the recommendations seem to be, I'm not sure we're going to have tools even under the new assessment if we structure it this way. So my question is, if I have a third grader that absolutely knows everything in all the third grade standards, when he arrives on the first day in third grade and knows most of the things on the fourth grade standards, how do I know? I mean, obviously I haven't skipped him. He's in third grade, but performance-wise, knowledge-wise, he's really closer to a second semester fourth grade. How are we going to be able to measure the growth throughout that year for that student that is already beyond the third grade standards? And why wouldn't we use an adaptive test to do that?
So I'm going to table the adaptive question. I will get to that shortly. But I will simply say that I would agree that in your scenario, if you have a student that has full mastery, that entering third grade already has fully mastered the third grade standards, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to have an assessment that is going to be able to capture where they are. There will be this sort of ceiling effect in the scenario that you've given. I do think you have to ask, empirically, how often do we see that? And I would argue that if there's a large proportion of students in Indiana that come in at the start of third grade having already mastered all third grade standards, it suggests to me that your standards aren't rigorous enough. Now, I don't think that's likely the case with the new standards that are being written. I don't think you're likely to see, based on what I've seen in other scenarios in other states that have similarly attempted to revise their standards to focus on depth as well as breadth, to focus on college and career readiness, to focus on higher order thinking skills. What I've generally seen is that you're less likely to see scenarios where students enter the beginning of the grade having already mastered those higher order thinking skills. So I think you're less likely going forward to see these kinds of concerns. However, it is an empirical question, and you can see, looking at a large-scale assessment, you can find out how many students have perfect scores or near perfect scores. And if that's a large proportion of the population of students taking, you have a lot more of a problem and a worry around growth. So the way that I would address your question is I'd first want to find out how prevalent is the problem. If it's really prevalent, I'd ask some questions about the alignment of the test to your standards and your standards to what your real expectations are for students. But I'll get back.
Well, it just seems.
Go ahead,
Tony.
I'm sorry. It just seems we're creating an environment where parents that have students that are really excelling, where the parents are engaged and they've done what they need to do early on to make the students show up to day one reading and advance, where we're putting in those situations where they're going to pretty much have to seek private school admission to really have their kids continue at the pace that they've established during the first 5 to 7 years of their lives. Thank you.
So let me go to the second point. That was really, to some extent, a lead-in to this empirical result, that this is also something that was in Dr. Biener-Benner's memo. And I just want to point this out. This was looking at, and let me just explain this is an excerpt from his memo. It just shows for English language arts, and what I'm showing in this table, on the rows are listed for students. So this is student prior achievement in the year 2013, and the FRL percentage. And the unit of analysis here is a school, okay? And so what we're looking at is the correlation between a school's, for each student, the average prior achievement of a school, and then the growth computed by a number of different ways, okay? And so the ones that are all titled A3, B1, B3, C1, C2 are all based on the value table categorical approach to looking at growth. Then SGP is based on the student growth percentile approach, taking the mean of student growth percentiles. And what you can see in the very first row is that if we look at the correlation in prior year mean achievement, so that's a way of looking at status for the school. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the comparison between a status metric and a growth metric, right? And what you can see here is that you see that the correlations are stronger, especially in the first 3 categorical growth approaches. The correlations are about 0.55 between prior achievement and growth. And then also you can see that there's a fairly moderate correlation with FRL percentage. So what does this imply? It implies that if you are using, in particular, the first 3 categorical growth approaches, you would see that in general the schools that are going to be rewarded and get points in the system for growth will be, in fact, more likely to be the schools that were higher achieving schools, and will be more likely to be the schools that were lower poverty schools. That's what those, in those first 3 columns, that's what that information is telling you. In C1 and C2, you can see that drops a little bit, okay? And then in the student growth percentile approach, you can see that those correlations are the lowest, okay? So one of the perceived advantages of the student growth percentile approach is the fact that you see there's this sense in which there's more of a leveling of the playing field, that you see less of the case that the schools that are rewarded for growth don't tend to be the schools necessarily that are the higher achieving schools, don't necessarily tend to be the schools that are the lower poverty schools. And you might ask, well, why is it that in the categorical approach we're seeing these stronger correlations? After all of these columns are all trying to give you an indication of student growth, right? So part of what this is showing is that, yes, there are different ways of getting at student growth, and they can have different relationships and tell you different stories about which schools are the schools that are high growth or low growth schools. In this case, having seen a little bit behind the scenes how the categorical growth approaches were being formed, especially for A3, B1, B3, what was happening in these value tables is that schools were being given quite a bit of credit and points in the value table if students maintain the same position, right? So if you were proficient one year, you're proficient the next, or I guess it's pass plus 1 year and pass plus the next, right? A school was given a lot of credit and points for that, right? And it's unclear if you stay in the same proficiency level, are you in fact growing or are you just maintaining? So by giving a lot of points for those who maintain position, you're essentially replicating a lot of status. So a lot of status is getting built into your growth metric. The C1 and C2 approaches, if I recall correctly, gave less credit for maintaining the same position. That's why you're seeing less of a correlation with status. Okay. So I just wanted to put this out there. It's something for you to appreciate that on the one hand, it's nice to sort of think through how can we, what do we want growth to be? But sort of looking at sort of what it communicates about what schools are making high growth and what schools are making low growth is an important piece of the puzzle, and this is one reason that Dr. Bienerbrenner has proposed the particular approach that he's advocated. So I'll pause there because I'm ready to sort of move into the NWA and MAP test, but I want to see if there are any particular questions on the growth component at this point.
Go ahead and continue.
Okay. So a question brought to my attention about a concern about the MAP tests, or not a concern, but a number of districts I understand and schools have advocated for the use of the MAP tests, and what, given that Indiana is transitioning, why go through the rigmarole of inviting new vendors and going to develop new items when we have the MAP test, and the MAP test has been used by a lot of schools. They seem to be very happy with it. It seems to do all the things we want a test to do. Why not use it? And let me just say that from the start, that it seems clear from the number of schools that use MAP, not just in Indiana, but in other states as well, there are a lot of people who use it and are very happy with it. And a lot of people express positive feelings about using the test and that it seems to be helpful to them. So from the start, it's, regardless of the technical properties of the test and what I can say as a psychometrician, clearly they're doing something right in that they have a lot of satisfied customers, okay? But I will caution that the MAP was designed to be an interim assessment for use as a complement or supplement to a state exam written for high stakes purposes, okay? And when you develop an exam and you talk about validity of the exam, a key criterion is validity for what? For what use? And to the extent that MAP has not been designed and intended for use in high-stakes accountability settings, there is no bank or store or collection of validity studies that would suggest the MAP could be used for this purpose. So it's very hard to sort of even speculate about what would happen when you take a test that was developed to be used as a complement to a high-stakes assessment that's intent is for something that teachers could have immediate feedback to and use to sort of tailor their instruction. What happens when you attach now high stakes to that, right? So there is this idea of Campbell's law, which is this: as soon as you put high stakes on something, it increases the chance that it's going to be corrupted. So one of the things we don't know, even though we have a lot of information on people who have used the MAP in the past and have been very happy with it, we absolutely have no evidence yet what happens when you now attach high stakes to something that was low stakes before. What will the impact be on the way that will the MAP really have a perception that's much different from the perception of a lot of other high stakes tests when once the high stakes gets placed on the MAP in the same way. So at this point, it's very hard to speculate about what the impact will be, but it's very likely that it will have the same sort of impacts you might expect any test that goes from low to high stakes. So that's a first point, which is that right now, in terms of the validity evidence that would need to be mustered for the map, we don't have a lot to draw on. We don't have a lot of examples of a state that has taken the map and made the map the state accountability test. That hasn't happened yet. So if you were to do something like that, recognize you'd be moving into very uncharted waters where there's really no evidence for what you can expect. Another concern about the map is that the map, so let me just say this. Here are some questions that I would pose to NWA. Okay, so first question is, how large is the map item bank? How often are new items introduced and old items retired? I've looked at NWA's materials on these sorts of things, and they don't provide a lot of information about that item bank. My understanding is they've had a long-standing item bank, which they use with a lot of their clients across the country. But to the extent that this would be a test that would now be aligned to new standards, that's going to require a large bank of new items that have been developed specifically for Indiana standards. If you're simply retrofitting old items that have been around for a long time, it's hard to make the case how those items could possibly be aligned to Indiana standards. Go ahead.
Well, they've already adapted the map to the Common Core.
Well, they say this. I have yet to understand exactly how they've done that. So and let me just give you one piece that I just as
I just need a clarifying question, because
Yeah.
I don't want us to be out of compliance with anything. We have started the RFI process, and we're going to begin the RFP process soon. Are we in territory talking about vendors that we shouldn't be in territory for? I just want to be sure that we're not violating anything, because when we went through that RFI process, you know, we were told every time that questions regarding these vendors need to go through another process. I just want to be sure we're not violating anything here, because I'm feeling very uncomfortable talking about a vendor who's already submitted RFI and may possibly submit an RFP. So
I guess there are two things. The board has been, and the assessment subcommittee has been talking about adaptive versus formative, and this was
well, that's one
conversation in front
question.
of the Education Roundtable. And then additionally, since Dr. Briggs is the consultant for the State Board of Education, he's providing information to help analyze and understand the responses to the RFI that were publicly submitted. We're not releasing any contents of that document, but he is trying to help provide information around adaptive versus formative and how that works and things that
my
a
point
policy
is
setting board
my
should
point is the
consider.
assessment subcommittee did not hear from NWEA, and yet we are
I agree.
here
I agree with
discussing
the
it. I'm
superintendent
just
saying
feeling
as far
uncomfortable.
as that slide has NWEA on it, that's a problem.
Well, I'm sure that we can shift to, so again, I do think under public access, the receipt of information action includes receipt of information, and to the extent that a consultant is helping inform the board for matters that they would make decisions, we thought that it would be appropriate to have this conversation publicly around information on adaptive versus formative. There's been a lot of conversation. My understanding, there was even a
It's okay to
petition
talk
given
about adaptive
particular to
versus
this.
formative. I'm not questioning talking about the topic of adaptive and formative at all. I'm not questioning the expert to say that NWEA was designed as a formative test and not as a summative. That's a fact. I'm getting very uncomfortable that we're actually engaging in dialogue regarding the vendor and what it offers and starting to have questions and dispute it. I'm just feeling very uncomfortable when I have somebody from the government agency that oversees this giving us clear warnings about talking to the vendors and gathering information, and we go through that avenue to do that. I'm feeling very uncomfortable.
So if I could draw a clear line between talking to a vendor as an entity that would potentially contract versus having an expert consultant that the board has contracted with to get information to analyze vendor responses, I think those are two different matters. Because here again,
you have contracted with and paid money to an expert, a national expert, to provide information to you so that you can make informed decisions. And again, since public access law includes defining, it defines action as receipt of information that would lead to making decisions, we thought this was appropriate.
I would rather have the approval of the agency that actually is overseeing this process now.
I've never read anything that has indicated that to have a consultant help you analyze information or to get expert information to analyze responses, that requires running it through IDOA.
And I guess
and we are not in any way publicly displaying the contents of that RFI response. This is a conversation around theoretically when you use adaptive versus formative and understanding how the questions, just as we were with growth, the questions that the board should ask itself when making selections.
And if we are to the point, if we get to the point where we're actually looking at this vendor and we would ask these kinds of questions, I think that would be appropriate.
I could amend this such that, we'll strike questions for just questions, all right? And then instead of map, just take out map.
Well, and as a subcommittee, I guess I would say that we know we need to ask these kinds of questions of the vendors.
Okay.
And we've been dealing with that and have made that, known.
Yeah, the bottom line, we've heard.
I do want to ask a
Wait
question.
just a moment,
We've heard
please.
from
Wait
it.
just a moment, please.
Yeah.
Go through the chair. Tony, and then David, and then Dan. Tony? Tony?
This is Brad.
Oh, Brad, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought I heard the other voice.
Not a problem. I do want to get back to asking a question of back to how this data helps us help students, and my question's around this whole discussion of an adaptive test versus a fixed form test. I do believe when we're done, we want to make sure that we have the ability to see not just proficiency, but we have to be able to see growth. But I know it raises some concerns about compliance with what state law says we can do in terms of comparisons. And I don't know if this is a Michelle question or a Dr. Briggs question, but my concern is going to be is that if you have an adaptive test, and I may be wrong on thinking this, but the only way we can get to that is through some use of technology where basically the test is able to be adapted based on responses by the student. It seems to me like if there were concerns about that, as long as a fixed form test can help us set an anchor with each individual student, that we can then look back and compare a student to themselves based on past performance, there ought to be a way for us to use individualized targets with students to be able to address some of the growth components. If I'm wrong on that, help me understand that, but it just seems to me like a fixed form test might be the better way to address schools that may struggle on the technology infrastructure side to be able to do an adaptive test.
Yeah, I think that's a fair, that anticipates a little bit of a recommendation I would make, which is that I think in the early goings you should be doing a fixed form approach. To get to the sort of punchline of what I'm going to say about adaptive tests versus fixed form is that I would say that for sure in some ways you could say a computer adaptive test is sort of the holy grail of large-scale assessment. That's what you'd like to be able to do. It has all kinds of tremendous advantages if you can pull it off. It can minimize measurement error. It's the most efficient use of testing time and provides immediate feedback. So who wouldn't want an adaptive test? The problem is that you get what you pay for, and the costs here are quite high. To pull off an adaptive test, there are a lot of things that are needed. These are the things I mentioned on the next slide, which is that you need a very, very large item bank. Items are costly to write. And if you're writing a large item bank, you're going to probably need more items than you would need in a fixed form. Each item costs a lot of money to develop, and you're going to need proportionally more of them if you do an adaptive test. Since every test event in an adaptive setting is different, it's a lot harder to establish test alignment to the standards. This is actually a developing area in large-scale assessment research. We actually don't even have a model yet for how you establish that a computer adaptive test is aligned. Right? There are a lot of things being proposed and suggested, but we're in uncharted territory here for talking about alignment. Another issue with an adaptive test is that to the extent that you have a test blueprint that says, listen, we need certain amount of items that focus on this area in mathematics, that need to be at this depth of knowledge, and we want to make sure that everybody gets an equal distribution of items across the test, Keep in mind that the way an adaptive test works, right, to actually minimize measurement error, is it basically, this is very simple to explain, it simply says when a student takes a question, you give them a question that's sort of in the middle range of difficulty. If they get it right, you give them a slightly harder question. If they get it wrong, you give them a slightly easier question. And you keep doing this until you hone in on what you think their location is on the score scale, right? So notice that what I said there had nothing to do with what kinds of items in terms of content that they're getting. It has everything to do with the difficulty of the items, right? So if difficulty is not evenly distributed across the test blueprint, there may be times where the algorithm that says, oh, I need a harder item, well, what if you haven't given any items in geometry at this point, and it says I need harder items? There are no harder items. They're in the geometry strand. Now the algorithm is in conflict, and it's not quite clear what's the way that, if you have to satisfy the constraint of giving a geometry item, it might not be the right in terms of difficulty item, right? So once you have that conflict come in, it's no longer the case actually in most computer adaptive tests that have to meet these kinds of specifications that you always have minimum measurement error. And so pretty soon the relationship of what a student's score is to measurement error starts looking a lot more similar to a fixed form test. So even in the case of a computer adaptive test, the second you start building in constraints on what items have to be administered according to the content of the items, one of the advantages of the computer adaptive test is no longer as great as it was relative to a fixed form. So this isn't so much something that goes wrong per se, but if one of the things that you thought was the reason we want an adaptive test is we want to make sure that we can really locate with great precision, no matter where a student is on the scale, that we can do that with great precision. That can come into conflict if you're setting constraints on what kinds of items you want to make sure that students have been exposed to.
So if I was going to summarize, at this time, we would not be wise. There's too many unknowns there.
Yeah,
and the algorithms start bouncing off one another.
The last thing is this: is that given if you're going to do an adaptive test, you want to have time to figure out how to do this right. You don't want to jump into it where you have a very tight timeline, tight budget, just to force it in. And it's much easier to go from a fixed form to an adaptive test. But to go back from an adaptive to a fixed form, that's a whole other issue. It's much better to be conservative, I think, to start with a fixed form test, learn something about the properties of that fixed form test, and then gradually you can build it into adaptive tests.
I appreciate your presentation. I think that's probably the salient point for us as we look at these things conceptually. You might want to do something, but it's how and when and what do you do first and how do you build towards it. And I appreciate you putting this into English for us. It's understandable. It's very complex.
Sure.
Okay, so it was Tony, and then it was supposed to be David, and then Dan, but David says his question's been answered.
Yeah,
I guess he still has something.
When you talk about a computer adaptive test, I'm trying to align computer and the adaptive test. Is that seamlessly aligned versus a paper and pencil test?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Can you speak to that issue? I think we're committed to going with technology, obviously, but are there challenges when you do that compared to paper and pencil?
For sure. I mean, paper and pencil, it's harder to be adaptive in paper and pencil, right? I mean, it goes to speak. I mean, you certainly can't have it at the item level. You can't be adaptive on a paper and pencil form. The best you could do if you're doing paper and pencil is you could have stages of forms where you get a sort of a branching system where students initially take a form. The difficulty there, of course, is it would have to be a multi-day event, or it would have to be something where if it were paper and pencil, where in one sitting all students took kind of a router test. Then you had that scan. So that router test, by the way, would all have to be scannable items, multiple choice scored items that could be quickly scored where you immediately get results. So you'd have to have a process where that router test would occur that day, or within a week at least. You would have to have those results put into a system, so you would actually have the student score. Based on the student score, then you could route students to test forms that now were a little bit easier, a little bit in the middle, a little bit harder, for example. So if you're doing paper and pencil, that's the closest you can get probably to an adaptive type test when you don't have the luxury of computer.
My follow-up question is, sometimes we discuss policy issues in isolation. There are 49 other states out there, and because you're a national expert, are there other states we should look to gain some wisdom?
Sure. So one state that's doing a computer adaptive test that is not part of one of the Common Core consortia is Utah. So they would be probably a good example for how they've proceeded with this. They're an example where I would say they're doing a computer adaptive test, but they started this about a year ago in the run-up, so they had an extra year time, lead time, and they contracted with a client that's pretty well known for doing computer adaptive tests, and so they have a lot to build on in that sense.
Would it also be safe to say that they must measure on grade level performance as well as do the adaptive portion? That it's really a combination of kind of a fixed form kind of thing and an adaptive, being able to get both pieces of information.
It's a very good question. So that's one of the, when I mentioned constraints, that's a version of a constraint, which is the question, like if it's purely adaptive, then the test is really just going to figure out where you are, regardless of whether you're giving them grade level material or not. So the question that was posed much earlier that said, well, what if I had a student that already had mastered third grade standards at the beginning of the third grade? Well, by the spring of the third grade, you would imagine that would, if it were a purely adaptive test, what a student would be getting would be fourth grade material, right? However, in most states, and this is also for the Common Core Consortium tests, there are constraints that say you will receive on-grade material by some, at least like 80% or something like that, where there's maybe some leeway to draw, and this is something that I know that, for example, the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium is grappling with right now because they are an adaptive test. How much leeway do you have to grab material that's above and below grade level?
Well,
My other question deals with...
Sorry.
Yes.
Because the federal government actually requires us to do on grade level assessment pieces. So, I mean, that's part of the issue. How do we get real information regarding student performance and yet still say you've met these standards at this grade level? So I think that's a quandary that all the states are in, really. You know, we would like to have some true measures.
I do think that my understanding is that the federal government has been offered a little bit of leeway for Smarter Balance. Not a great deal, not a great deal, but a little bit. So while still the vast majority of test items have to be drawn from items aligned to grade level standards, there's been a little bit of flexibility for students that are at the very extremes to prevent these floor and ceiling effects.
David?
Would you address the issue of diagnostic information coming back to the individual teacher? I think that's really critical. Many times we get summative assessment data on a policy level, but I want to be sure teachers are getting diagnostic information back on each and every student so the teacher has the opportunity to tailor instruction for that particular student.
Right.
Is that possible? What recommendations would you have for us on that issue?
So in general, I'm very pessimistic that any summative assessment will be very useful for diagnostic purposes. I'll just start with that. I'm pessimistic that this is I'm pessimistic for a lot of reasons. There's one structural reason why that hasn't been possible in the past, and one reason for optimism that it might in the future. Structurally, the reason why it was almost impossible in the past is timing. That teachers would often not get information on a summative assessment until well after they no longer had the students in the classroom. So students would take the test exam in spring, not get results until over the summer. And so at that point, to the extent that it has any diagnostic utility, only in the sense of a teacher saying, perhaps being reflective and saying, well, many of my students didn't do well, what can I do differently the next time, right? That's the mechanism you might hope that a summative assessment would provide. But if you're thinking diagnostic assessment in terms of actually for individual students saying, what are the strengths and weaknesses of individual students? How can I individualize instruction to help this particular student make progress? In general, summative assessments are not written to that level of detail. They've in the past been written to cover the breadth of content standards. And when you're trying to focus on a particular area that a student knows, you often need to really hone in and have a large number of questions targeted to that area, and also asking usually more information than you can often get from a multiple choice item. So the difficulty in getting a diagnostic assessment, there are two pieces. One, what's the immediacy of the feedback to the teacher? And structurally, we haven't often had feedback that's very immediate. Now, you might argue that going forward, to the extent that you have computer-based tests, it might be possible to get feedback sooner, right? That's, of course, with an adaptive test, one of the strong features. But the second part is not just getting feedback soon, but it's the quality of the feedback. How much information are you really getting about a student's strengths and weaknesses? And so that's another piece to the puzzle. So you have to ask, is the collection information, if it's just multiple choice items, the question is, how diagnostic can you get from just multiple choice items? Perhaps if they're really well written, you can get, and if they're really targeting one particular area, perhaps it can tell you something important about a student. Up till now, I haven't seen a lot of cases of large-scale summative assessments that have achieved that kind of diagnostic utility. There's some hope going in the future, but note that even the Common Core Assortia tests never made the claim that the summative components, so PARC and Smarter Balance, that's why they've always talked about different pieces of the assessment system that they would build. There would be an end-of-year type assessment, there's also going to be interim assessment, and there would be formative assessments. And these were all pieces that were meant to go together. So I'm somewhat pessimistic that just by only taking the summative piece, you're able to get really good diagnostic information.
So it's possible we could create an assessment system that would be a number of assessment indicators. And so the summative assessment would be one component that it'd be difficult to get diagnostic, but there could be other school-related or school corporation-related, or maybe from a state level, a diagnostic component to this overall system that would inform the teacher.
I think that would absolutely be possible, and one of the things I think is potentially powerful is you want to have this be a little bit more grassroots. You want to have a little bit more this coming from the districts and the schools themselves as to sort of what are the areas that they see as being important and developing some sort of common assessments along that. But I think that's a much better than, rather than trying to have one test do everything, I think building a system that has many different components is definitely a good way to go.
Dr. Riggs, do you have more of your presentation? I'm just mindful of the time and the agenda.
Sure, absolutely. The last bit of this is the last component I wanted to talk about, which is the College and Career Readiness Transition Assessment. And my understanding is there's a lot that's in flux about this. So let me just talk about what I understand at present. It does appear right now that in terms of this College and Career Readiness, the CCRTA, it appears that the state will only be leasing these items.
We're not, maybe I need to have Michelle address, because I don't believe we're doing what's up there. Am I? Yeah, we're doing a full operational assessment. We're not doing a transition.
Well, okay, so my understanding is that there is, so this is where I could use a little help. My understanding is that there will be there's an I-step, and then there's this other.
There's only going to be one test.
Okay, well,
I'm not sure this is relevant.
Well, I'm not so sure. I still think it might be. So if there's this one test, and if the items that are on this one test are being leased from CTB for this one test, there is a potential concern you might have in going forward if you have a new test vendor that is not CTB. And if you set standards for the next testing that takes place on this one assessment, if this next assessment, you set standards and set cut points and proficiency levels on the next assessment, and then you choose a different vendor that is not CTB. If the items that were being used in this next spring assessment are CTB-owned items, such that you can't use those items again for the next vendor, it's going to potentially create some problems in you equating the cut scores that you've set on the assessment in the spring with the new assessment for the new vendor in the following spring.
So if I could have Michelle come and clarify what it is that we are doing in Indiana. Thank you, Michelle. This is Michelle Walker, our Director of Assessment.
Hey, Derek. So just to clarify, we actually are looking at possibly leasing the items for the future so that we can actually do the equating for the future. I think that's really what you needed to know. Okay.
Can you say that one more time?
Go ahead, Michelle. I don't think everybody heard.
Sorry.
Just into the microphone.
Sorry. I think we talked about this at another board meeting, but looking at the interoperability of the items so that we could actually lease the items for whatever vendor we might use in 15-16.
Yeah, the only thing I'll just still mention about that, the whole leasing versus owning, and this is not a deep area of expertise, but I would just say that I'm not sure I'm entirely clear on if items are being developed from, so they might start by being items that were developed by a testing company that get at things that are thought to be similar to Indiana standards. Not that there's anything wrong with Iowa. If this is the case, if the items are being tailored to Indiana, it's unclear to me why Indiana wouldn't then eventually want to own the items. So that piece is a little bit fuzzy to me. And one thing I just would raise as an issue is that I think the terms of sort of leasing need to be clear in that, does that mean that the only thing you get the items for is to administer the items and then get student scores on the items, then you never see the items again? I think it's important that in leasing that it always means you have access to see the items and to look at the quality of the items. That's sort of an important piece that I think you might consider. I would just say this, I still am a little hazy, and if there's one assessment being developed, what I've seen this described as is an operationalized field test, and I don't know what that means. And I'm sort of an expert in this area, so it always worries me when I hear a term being used about what's happening in assessment that I've never heard of before. So in the language I've seen talked about in terms of what an operationalized field test it means, it's defined as such because according to what I've seen from CTB, the test will contain both operational field test items, but I don't really have any good sense for what proportion of these items are operational and which won't. And the only thing I can say is to quote Inigo Montoya from the movie The Princess Bride, who says at one point, I do not think that word means what you think it means. So an operationalized field test, I don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean, but generally, if you're giving a field test, it's a field test. If you're giving an operational test, it's an operational test. You can sometimes have an operational test with slots for field test items. It sounds like that's what's going on, but I don't know exactly this operationalized field test distinction. I'm still a little hazy on, and I would just sort of suggest that going forward, that make sure that component is clear. So that's really all I had in sort of prepared, but and I'll end with that. But if there are any questions or things that I can help clarify, I'm happy to do so.
Yes, Andrea?
Does any test exist that will comply with all the requirements of law and yet not lend itself to teaching to the test?
So I think that's a great.
That's the
a fair,
best question of the day, Andrea.
That's a totally fair question. I think the response often has been, and the perspective that's often been taken in the new tests that are being developed according to the Common Core and according to other interpretations of the Common Core that have been made, is that the idea is teaching to the test is a reality, and the question is, what does that mean exactly, right? And so if it means that by teaching to the test, you're actually teaching to the standards the test have been written to, and the test just reflects those standards. For example, if the test now involves performance tasks that are very rich and the kinds of things you'd want kids to be doing in class, then teaching the test might actually be a good thing. On the other hand, if teaching the test involves focusing on superficial features of the test just to beat the test, if it just has kids practicing, practicing tests to get good at the skill of taking tests as opposed to the content that the tests are focusing on, then that's a terrible thing, right? And it's a bit of an open question whether these new tests that are meant to be written to richer standards and are meant to be more authentic to what you want learning to be, whether that will occur is, I think, an open question.
So let me test my inverse premise. If you have great teachers and great curriculum, shouldn't they be able to do well on any test, whether it's specifically aligned to the curriculum or not?
That's right.
You betcha.
I think that's absolutely true, and that's why one of the things that's a really smart thing to do is to have audit tests. In a lot of cases where you try to diagnose whether teaching the test has occurred, sometimes people will use NAEP as an example. They'll look at sort of performance and trends on the state performance on NAEP, and if they see that performance looks really dramatic on the state assessment, but it doesn't look dramatic on the NAEP assessment, you start to wonder. I mean, sure, they're not the same assessment and they're written to different standards, but if you really see something dramatic happening on the state test that's not happening, showing up at all on the NAEP test, it might suggest teaching the test is a concern. And it's not, that you couldn't just say if you have a great curriculum and great teachers, it should show up on any test. That might be one way to examine that. But this is an entirely fair point. There's a real concern, I think, a very legitimate concern about that, with the emphasis of large-scale assessment and high-stakes accountability, that you have teachers focusing on the test to the detriment of what the tests are meant to represent. I can speak very personally here that even in the state of Colorado, I'm a parent, I have a kid in schools, and I often feel that the school year ends as soon as the testing is done. And that you don't see the same emphasis and the same concern for what's coming home anymore after the testing is concerned. And that's absolutely what you don't want to occur. That suggests sort of a focus that what's really important is just getting kids ready to take the test, as opposed to the test is just a point along the way that's trying to put a little thermometer in and see where kids are. at that point in time in terms of the focus of the curriculum over the point of the year. So in that sense, beyond having kids practice to make sure they're used to using the computer and they're not thrown, they should have that exposure, right? So it shouldn't be a novel experience on the test. That part they should have practice on. But if they're just drilling on items that the people think are going to be on the test, then that's far more problematic to me.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, Brad?
I just wanted to jump in and just say that whatever we do on this, my concern has been is that when we go forward with a new test, we just make sure that we have a tight alignment because with regard to taxonomy, because the standard calls for one level of skill. There's always a taxonomy in how it's taught, but then how we assess that needs to line up as well. So all this conversation about teaching to the test and whatnot, I think the key thing is that when we're done, if in fact our state assessment is going to be helpful to our teachers and our students, we have to, one, make sure that alignment is tight in the selection of those test questions, and two, as we go forward with this process, that individual student growth data is able to map back to some kind of historical trend line on that student so we can see how they're individually doing, as well as preserving a way of knowing that they're proficient at each grade level. That to me seems to be the critical constructs in all this discussion about a 15, 16 test and beyond.
Thank you. Which brings us to the next item of action. Thank you, Dr. Briggs.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you
your
very
comments.
much.
Really
Regarding the resolution to adopt K-12 assessments. So I want to make a couple of statements here before, actually, I think we should go ahead and do a motion. Do I have a motion to approve? We'll do a discussion on this. Do I have a motion to approve the resolution to adopt the K-12 assessments?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, we're ready for discussion of this topic. I want to just express my the importance of this topic on assessments in the system. And so I don't know if I need to apologize to the subcommittee on assessment or not, but I strongly feel that we didn't have a process in this going to the round table, and I feel bad about that. That we didn't really help to inform what went to the round table, because I felt that was my intention of forming the subcommittee to begin with. Be that as it may, it went to the round table, and what you have before you is an assessment system to inform the RFP process. I was very vocal at the round table meeting regarding one item. I want to reiterate that to you and to the board and my commitment to reading in the state of Indiana. And I think Andrea and Dr. Briggs kind of ended on this note and talked about NAEP and the importance of making sure that what you're doing can obviously inform what is happening perhaps and how your students are performing on the NAEP assessment. I do consider the NAEP assessment, especially regards to reading, to be a highly accurate portrayal of reading proficiency. And so in Indiana, I'm wanting to make sure that since we have this opportunity to move forward with a new assessment, that we make sure that we can actually have a measure of reading on this assessment that we spend millions of dollars giving. And I think we have a consensus to that reading kind of proponent. I'm prepared. I've done a little more research since the round table, and I know that the concern was around not the importance of reading, not really having a reading measure, but around the cost of the assessment or perhaps lengthening the assessment in order to get a reading measure. I see Michelle Walker. If you might address, I went back to the department and I said, you know, this is a valid concern about lengthening assessments. We've also made a commitment. We do not want to spend more time on assessments. So I went back and had conversation and dialogue that how can we get a reading measure on our assessment and not have to deal with those other constraints. So if you could
Sure.
speak, I would
Be glad
appreciate
to.
it.
So I think, you know, one of the important parts about the new standards that we've adopted in Indiana is the depth. And actually, Dr. Briggs talked about that college and career ready standards are really a lot deeper and a lot more involved with regard to higher level thinking. The breadth of the content is still there in K-12, but really the depth of knowledge that we're looking for is so much greater. As a result, we actually can provide not only an English language arts score, which is reading and writing, but we'll have enough depth in our reading items to actually give a reading score. And I know that's something that schools are very interested in. I know it's a passion of Superintendent Ritz's, but I don't know if any of you on the board remember when we used to give the Terra Nova when we had norm referenced component of ISTEP, but at that time we gave a reading score as well. So I think the time has come really for us to go ahead and give the data that we can generate based on the new tests that we're building. So it's an exciting time where we can actually look at language arts, English language arts, again, in terms of reading and writing, but then separate out the reading and have a separate score. So that's our intent.
So what you have in the resolution doesn't necessarily speak to getting a separate reading score. I don't think that precludes us, or it needs to be in this resolution to move forward, because that's data that we're going to collect as a result of the actual assessment. So, you know, I guess I'm really just looking for some consensus of the board that, you know, if we can collect reading data and have a separate measure, we would do that. What is in the resolution, which I support, in fact, I support everything in this resolution, is that we will also be able to measure specific reading skills, reading standards that we have. And that's important as well. But I also want to make sure that we are actually gathering a reading score for a couple of reasons that Dr. Briggs even mentioned. You want to see if your formative assessments are actually aligning with your summative in some way. And so when you are giving formative assessments and you're looking at your reading information, you want to have confirmation on your summative assessment that your formative assessments are actually doing the job and showing that your kids are proficient in reading. In addition to that, I don't know if you read in the DOE dialogue, but the United States Department is now putting in another piece to assess our requirements for special education, and that's looking at the NAEP scores for reading and math with special education students. I think it's imperative that the state of Indiana have reading information to inform us how we are doing and progressing regarding the NAEP scores, and not just to be able to say we have a language arts scores which we cannot compare to a reading score. So I just urge the board to approve this resolution, but also with the caveat that you know, we can get reading information, we should supply reading information. Andrea?
The standardized test that my school uses, which is not a test widely used around the state, has a reading comp score as a subset of the language arts testing. I guess I just assumed that was the case with most language arts tests, and that's not the case?
You want to explain, Michelle, what our current assessment does? That's a good question, Andrea.
It is a good question.
I'm wanting it to do more than it does.
And our current assessment actually measures all of the reading and the writing. And when we developed iRead3, and we've kind of had this conversation before, but when we developed iRead3, we actually asked the teachers that came to set the cut scores on ISTEP in grade 3 if we could actually generate a reading score. And they just didn't feel like we were asking enough items to separate out reading. So we've been measuring reading, but in the context of language arts as a greater, I guess, domain, I would say. So we've been measuring reading, but not to the extent that we will be measuring in the future based on our new standards, which actually will help us generate that reading score.
But we do not get a comprehensive score on reading.
Right.
And what Michelle was saying in her first remarks is that we now have the capability of fully doing that.
Right.
David?
So I watched the Education Roundtable meeting where this was discussed. You made a motion to add to the resolution, and that was rejected by the Education Roundtable. What you're talking about today, I'm trying to align with that was rejected by the Education Roundtable. Is this the same concept you presented there that was rejected, or is this a new concept, what you just talked about?
No, the concept of what I want to do is still the same. And I'm prepared to make an amendment if I need to. I'm hoping that that's not necessary, because after going back after the roundtable, I heard the arguments. I went back to my experts and I said, here are the arguments. Are we capable of getting a reading score? And I don't believe this RFP really speaks to the data we get from the assessment. It speaks to what we want the assessment to actually ascertain, what we want it to, the parameters of the assessment. So I was never opposed to anything in the resolution. I just wanted to be sure that we were going to get a reading score, and I didn't feel that that was expressed within here. I don't think we really do need me to amend this in order to have that happen. It's a joint process of developing this RFP. My department and the staff board is going to get together to do this. Having reading information, being able to have that as a separate score
Join the conference.
is part of, it's like, are we going to get a language arts score? Are we going to get a math score? We're going to get a reading score. I also did comment that the accountability panel has recommended that we have 3 points of information to inform the accountability system, and that is math and language arts and reading. It's just imperative that we have reading information. We're going to be judged by it more and more frequently, and we have to have it. And I know we're going to have a great formative assessment that will give us some reading information, but we have to know if it's aligned with our summative assessment and make sure that we have those balances and checks to make sure that that's there. So I would prefer, it is the same topic. I'm thinking that we don't need a formal motion to make that happen, but if you're insisting, I suppose, if we don't have consensus, David, I suppose I can do that.
Let me try to restate the question, because
At
it's just
the
a
end-
yes/no
At the end
question.
of the roundtable,
Is this the same proposal you made at the education roundtable that they rejected? Just yes or no?
no, I made a formal, I've made a formal motion
Right.
at the roundtable to add an amendment. I am saying to you now.
Is this the same
because
amendment?
I've not proposed an amendment.
No, at the roundtable
all.
you did. But is it the same?
What I'm responding to is the comments after the vote. So it was asked for the conversation to continue, and I know Dan and I both committed to making sure this conversation was going to continue. I'm continuing
Okay.
the conversation here at the State Board of Education meeting. We have a subcommittee of the assessment that can easily work with this. We have an RFP process that's underway, and having reading information is doable. And I've been told that, and so I feel confident in improving this resolution as written, knowing that I have consensus from this board that we are committed to having a reading score.
May I?
Dan?
I have a question.
Oh, wait just a moment. Dan's first, and then you, Brad.
Okay, it doesn't matter what order, but in essence, the roundtables give us a recommendation, we're gonna vote on it, we say yes. Now, I just wanna see if this will take care of your concern, Superintendent. If it is possible to get additional reading information with the direction we've been given from the roundtable, and if that doesn't extend more testing and some of the concerns we had, we can do that at that time, but I'd kinda like to keep the resolution pure, and if we can get more information from it, and it helps us with reading assessment and reading instruction, and it doesn't violate some of the concerns we passed at the roundtable, the governor and all the other leaders in the state present, then of course we'd be okay with that, but I don't wanna change where we're going, and I just wanna make sure I understand what you're saying.
That was my point as
That's your
well.
point?
To
Okay.
keep the resolution intact, and my preference
Okay.
is not to make an
And
amendment.
so if you can do that,
That we
all the
as a
better.
board know
Yeah.
that that's something we want to have as a reading measure, and we're committed as the subcommittee in the RFP process
And the
to working with that.
Okay, let me ask one more question.
Sure.
And then the subcommittee, remind me who's all on the subcommittee?
Troy,
Okay.
Sarah, Carrie, and Brad,
And board staff's involved?
of course.
Okay, so we're basically saying, hey, if we can have our cake and eat it too, we're gonna do that. Is that what you're saying to us
Correct.
today? Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
So Brad, you had a comment?
I guess a question. I've always operated from the understanding that the board can't change something coming to it from the roundtable. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. My understanding was we could only vote up or down on a recommendation from them on something like this. So if that's not true, I'd like to know that. But two, I also think, obviously reading data is important, but I think there's more that we can get from an assessment as we go forward and looking at 15, 16, and beyond that could be included in the RFP.
I would concur with that statement, your last statement. As far as this recommendation to us, it is just, that's what it is. It's just suggestions on what we should put in our RFP. Certainly, there's been a lot of work done to try to get to this point. And as I said in the very beginning, I really, had hoped that the subcommittee would have actually informed this before it went even to the roundtable. That did not happen. So it's here, and I think there's concurrence amongst at least the department and the board staff regarding the items in here. And so I would move that we already have a motion to adopt, and we have a second. Any more discussion? Roll call, please.
Yeah, I'd like to make a
Oh,
comment.
sorry, Tony. Sorry. I keep forgetting that I have to pause for online.
Okay, is now a good time?
You may, sorry.
Okay. Well, as it relates to the fixed form summative assessment, I think really that is focused on the bare minimum of really what we're trying to assess kids should know. And I think we make a mistake if we focus too much on how many kids are meeting the bare minimum requirement. At least in my opinion, I said this when we talked about standards. The standards are a floor. They're not the ceiling. I mean, just because you can become proficient in the standards does not in any means make you actually competitive for jobs or college admission anywhere. It just means you know the basics of what we think you should know at that grade level. Now, fortunately, we have a lot of kids that operate well above the standards, and we are sort of just putting on blinders as to how we treat those students. And in fact, these are the students that we have that are going to be most likely to be most competitive as it relates to jobs and college admissions. And we're not tracking them properly. There is no way to track growth of an advanced student with a fixed form summative assessment. And those are the kids that we need to spend more resources and time, because quite frankly, they're the ones that are going to be most competitive going into the workforce. Now, it's great to know that we don't have kids that are basically failing and they're able to have basic skills, but the basic skills really are not competitive. So I would like to see a test that tracks growth for the most advanced students, and I just don't think we can do it with what we have here. I support everything else in the resolution.
So Tony, I would call,
Fixed form summative assessment.
Tony, I would call your attention to item number 4 in the actual resolution, which speaks to the formative assessments, and actually exploring the possibility of adaptive formal and adaptive formative optional assessments, which would
Optional, that assessment is optional.
That is true.
And it's also, because it's optional, likely not to be a part of the A to F accountability system. The fixed form summative is going to be in the A to F most likely, and this optional one, who knows who'll even use it. But I do credit the recommendation for saying that they think that the state should pay for that to be available. Thanks.
You're welcome, Tony. Roll call, please. Roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Eisner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
No.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Yes. And being as we've been in session for quite some time, we're going to call a quick recess. We will be back in recess at 11:05. Thank you. Yeah, it is freezing up here.